The moment had been decades in the making, but no one could have predicted it would finally arrive like this. A family, fractured by fame, scandal, and secrecy, was speaking out in unison, and the world would never be the same again. Thomas Markle, the father who had been vilified and silenced in equal measure. Samantha Markle, the outspoken sister who had long walked the line between media curiosity and personal grievance. And Doria Ragland, the calm and composed mother who had quietly watched events unfold from afar. Together, they had waited, restrained themselves, and now, at last, they were breaking the silence. The question that hung over everyone was simple. What exactly would they reveal about Meghan Markle, the woman who had transformed from an American actress into a global icon overnight? The first shock came immediately, even before a single detail had emerged. Thomas, who had been portrayed by tabloids as a distant, bitter figure, leaned forward in his chair, a glare in his eyes that spoke of both frustration and clarity. "It wasn't pain," he said, the words deliberate, cutting. "It was strategy." The room seemed to pause. This was not the father of the princess the world had been led to believe. This was a man unveiling the mechanics behind a narrative that had captivated millions, the hidden engine that had driven a story of struggle, persecution, and ultimate triumph. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Samantha Markle followed, her voice sharp, uncompromising. She called it Meghan's biggest lie yet. The orchestration of a victim persona so compelling it had bent public opinion, manipulated media outlets, and forced the royal family itself into reactive positions. It was a revelation that carried weight not merely because of Samantha's words, but because of the evidence, the intimate knowledge of family dynamics, and the patterns of behavior she had observed over years. The narrative that had seemed so straightforward, an American girl wronged by an archaic institution, fighting her way to equality and justice, was being dismantled piece by piece. Doria Ragland, the mother whose calm had been a silent counterpoint to public chaos, then spoke. Unlike Thomas and Samantha, her tone was measured, almost detached, yet it carried an undeniable authority. She painted a portrait of a woman who had meticulously plotted her path, coaching her team, shaping interviews, and choreographing her public interactions in a way that maximized sympathy while minimizing accountability. She spoke not from anger but from observation, from the subtle, persistent patterns she had witnessed, the small but telling actions that revealed intention, manipulation, and careful planning. What made this story explosive, however, was not just the claims themselves. It was the convergence of three independent voices, all pointing to a single truth. Meghan Markle's public persona, the one millions had embraced, may have been an elaborate construction, a calculated performance designed to position her as the ultimate royal victim. And if that were true, the implications were staggering. It was no longer a story about family disagreements or tabloid sensationalism. It was a story about strategy, power, and control, a revelation that reframed the very narrative the world had been sold for years. To understand the magnitude of what was being revealed, one must rewind. Long before the headlines, before the lavish weddings and global magazine covers, Meghan Markle had been a relatively private individual, known in Hollywood circles, but hardly a household name. Yet almost overnight, she transitioned into royalty, the center of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. The transition was breathtaking in both its speed and its spectacle. Cameras, media outlets, and social media audiences around the globe were suddenly focused on every smile, every gesture, every word. Every public appearance was a performance, whether intentional or not. But what Thomas, Samantha, and Doria were suggesting was that behind the scenes, these performances were meticulously directed. Consider the subtlety of the claims. According to the three family members, Meghan had not simply reacted to circumstances, she had anticipated them. She had coached statements, guided her public image, and emphasized moments of hardship in order to cultivate a particular narrative. Each interview, each carefully chosen anecdote, was not merely a reflection of experience. It was a tactical move, a calculated effort to generate empathy, to frame herself in a specific light, and to maintain control over her story. In the world of public relations, such precision is rare, but in the world of royalty, where image is everything, the stakes could not be higher. And yet, the revelations carried an emotional punch precisely because they were coming from family. There is a fundamental difference between a journalist exposing inconsistencies and a father, sister, and mother recounting the ways a loved one may have manipulated them, used their pain for narrative gain, or orchestrated media appearances. It is a betrayal that cuts deeper than public scandal because it carries personal weight. Viewers are drawn not merely to gossip or spectacle, but to the human story, the family caught between love, loyalty, and the realization that the person they thought they knew may have been acting according to an entirely different script. Thomas spoke of specific incidents, moments where decisions that seemed personal were, in fact, strategic. Samantha illustrated patterns of behavior, ways in which conversations were carefully staged and selectively shared. Doria highlighted the psychological precision of the public-facing persona, the methods of eliciting empathy while maintaining control. Together, their narratives converged into a portrait of intention, premeditation, and calculated image management. The audience is left with an unavoidable tension. What was genuine, and what was performance? And perhaps more importantly, what was the ultimate goal? To add another layer of complexity, consider the media's role. For years, outlets had propagated a narrative that supported Meghan's image, amplifying her voice and framing her story in a sympathetic light. The family's revelations suggest that this was not merely coincidental. If Meghan had been directing these narratives, coaching interviews, and guiding media coverage, the press had unwittingly, or perhaps intentionally, become instruments in her strategy. Suddenly, the relationship between family, media, and monarchy takes on a new dimension, one that merges psychology, influence, and the meticulous curation of public perception. It is here that the curiosity gap is deepest. The audience knows there is a story, but the details remain tantalizingly out of reach. The hints of manipulation, strategy, and premeditation are laid out in fragments, but the full picture is not yet complete. What Thomas, Samantha, and Doria are about to reveal next will connect the dots, exposing the mechanics of a carefully constructed narrative and potentially appending what the public has believed for years. So why does this matter now? Why are these revelations surfacing at this moment, after years of silence? Partly, it is the cumulative frustration of a family that has watched stories unfold without their voices being heard. Partly, it is the timing. The world has been primed by a decade of intense media scrutiny, social media amplification, and cultural fascination with the royal family. But most importantly, it is because the truth, in this case, carries both personal and public weight. The stakes are not merely reputation or perception. They are legacy, history, and the framing of a narrative that will be remembered long after the headlines fade. And yet, as the introduction closes, a final, haunting question lingers. Thomas, Samantha, and Doria have spoken, but the most explosive claims are still to come. They have teased the story, hinted at the strategy, and exposed cracks in a persona the world had accepted. But what comes next? What revelations lie deeper in the family's experience, the private moments, and the hidden strategies, has the potential to shock, divide, and redefine everything the public thought they knew about Meghan Markle. The camera pans back, the voices fade, and the audience is left with a simple but piercing thought. The narrative is not over. The story is only beginning. And what Thomas, Samantha, and Doria will reveal in the chapters ahead may forever change the way we see fame, power, and the price of a carefully constructed life. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Thomas Markle leaned back in his chair, a shadow of exhaustion crossing his face, yet his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. "People think I'm bitter," he said, almost under his breath, "but I'm not. I'm truthful, and the truth is nothing like the story they've sold to the world." The words landed like stones in the room, heavy and deliberate. This was not the man who had been reduced to tabloid caricature, the weary father frozen in guilt and embarrassment. This was a man who had watched a narrative unfold around his daughter and had chosen, finally, to step forward and reclaim the story from the media, from the palace, and from the illusions carefully constructed over years. The first revelation Thomas shared was subtle, yet devastating. He spoke of Meghan not as a victim, but as a strategist, a woman who understood the power of image, the sway of public sentiment, and the mechanics of modern celebrity. It wasn't about pain, he repeated, this time more firmly. Every tear you saw on camera, every public grievance, it was calculated. It was rehearsed. Every move she made was designed to create a story that the world would believe without question. Imagine that for a moment. A daughter, the one people adored, the center of countless headlines, the subject of millions of sympathetic clicks, standing in front of cameras and leaking her own pain, or at least the appearance of it, to manipulate the world. Could you reconcile that image with the girl you knew growing up? Thomas's words demanded it. His recollections were meticulous, painting a portrait of someone who had begun to shape her narrative years before she ever donned the royal title. He began recounting early examples, instances that many would dismiss as mundane or coincidental but which, to him, were patterns of intentional behavior. A family gathering, a private conversation, a subtle comment that later appeared in the press as if it had been spontaneous. She would repeat phrases, guide conversations, even direct my interviews with the press, Thomas said. Everything was a performance, nothing left to chance, and everyone, including me, became part of it without realizing it. At this moment, the emotional intensity in the room became palpable. Thomas paused, a rare vulnerability creeping into his voice. Do you know what it feels like to watch your child use your words, your life, your private moments, to create a public persona you never agreed to? To watch the world applaud her while you're dismissed, ignored, vilified? There was a silence, heavy and unbroken, that seemed to echo the weight of years of quiet observation. And yet, the revelations didn't end there. Thomas began to detail the mechanics of the strategy itself, the way in which Meghan allegedly coached her inner circle to emphasize suffering, conflict, and betrayal. He described long conversations, carefully constructed talking points, and moments of guidance where her team was instructed on how to frame stories for maximum media impact. It was not about justice. It was not about truth. It was about optics, perception, and control. She understood that the right story could bend the world to her favor, and she used it, Thomas explained. The audience might imagine this as a conspiracy theory, but Thomas's recounting was grounded in observation, specific events, and repeated patterns over years. He spoke of interviews where questions were anticipated, answers rehearsed, and emotions directed. He recalled moments when public vulnerability coincided with media leaks that painted her in a sympathetic light. He spoke of articles that appeared days after private family conversations, as if orchestrated, amplifying her narrative while leaving family members scrambling to respond. Thomas's tone shifted from factual to painfully personal. He described instances of family heartbreak, moments where private disputes were misrepresented to the press, and the strain that had created between siblings and parents alike. Samantha Markle, he noted, had long struggled to understand why the world seemed to accept her sister's version of events without question. It's not that the family is dishonest, he said. It's that she crafted a version of reality so compelling that everyone outside it would never question it. And even some of us inside it questioned ourselves. He recounted the emotional toll in vivid, almost cinematic detail. There were birthday parties where smiles masked tension, casual dinners where subtle comments were designed to later appear in headlines, and phone calls that seemed innocent until they appeared in media reports with carefully curated narratives attached. Every move was intentional. Every word weighed. Thomas emphasized. The room seemed to tighten with the gravity of his words, each detail building a sense of foreboding and revelation. Then, he turned to the topic of media manipulation, the area where his perspective became particularly damning. Do you think the media ever reports independently? He asked, voice rising slightly. No, she guided them. Every story, every photo, every sympathetic headline, it wasn't luck. It was deliberate. He described moments where reporters, under the guise of friendly interviews, were given subtly crafted statements, anecdotes that could be framed in multiple ways, each designed to support her carefully constructed image. It was genius in a way, but also heartbreaking to watch, Thomas admitted. She had everyone dancing to her tune, and I was one of the musicians she conducted. He paused, letting the audience absorb the weight of the revelation. The emotional impact was immediate, particularly for viewers who had believed in Meghan's struggles as authentic and unmediated. Here was a father, offering an unvarnished, intimate look at the dynamics of public image and personal manipulation, the kind of insider perspective rarely seen outside the tabloids, but far more credible because of the emotional proximity. The contradictions were glaring. How could someone loved by millions be accused of such strategic calculation? How could the world have been so enamored with a narrative that family insiders claimed was orchestrated from the start? Thomas himself grappled with these questions, and he shared the internal conflict in a way that was both relatable and riveting. "I love my daughter," he said softly. "I still do. But I had to see the truth for what it was, even if it broke my heart." Do you love someone enough to tell the world what they're really doing, even if it might hurt them? As he delved deeper, Thomas revealed moments where Meghan's public grievances and media statements coincided suspiciously with palace events, family gatherings, and personal incidents. The timing, he argued, was too precise to be coincidental. Every leak, every tearful statement, every carefully framed story served a purpose, advancing her narrative of suffering, victimhood, and persecution. She was always a step ahead, Thomas said. Every move calculated, every reaction anticipated, every headline predictable, but no one outside could see it. The tension escalated when he spoke about Samantha, the sister who had long been critical of Meghan's public persona. Thomas detailed how Samantha had begun to notice patterns years ago: subtle manipulations, repeated reframing of stories, and selective highlighting of personal pain for media attention. She wasn't lying to herself or the public, Thomas explained. She was building a platform, a story, and the rest of us were caught in it. By the end of his recounting, the audience was left with a sense of foreboding and anticipation. Thomas's voice, both weary and resolute, painted a picture of a carefully orchestrated plan that had shaped public perception, manipulated media, and strained family bonds. And yet, as damning as his statements were, they were only the beginning. And just like that, the spotlight shifted. Samantha Markle, long considered the outspoken sibling, leaned forward with a glare that demanded attention. "You think you know her," she said, voice sharp and deliberate, "but you don't. Not even close. This is her biggest lie yet." The room seemed to tighten, the words hanging in the air, heavy and undeniable. If Thomas had revealed strategy, Samantha was about to reveal motive. She began by recounting the early years, the moments that seemed trivial at the time but, in hindsight, were carefully curated steps in a master plan. Family gatherings, casual phone calls, shared vacations. All of these were not merely memories, but building blocks for a persona she would one day broadcast to the world. Every story, every tear, every conflict she shared publicly, it wasn't accidental, Samantha said. She coached people. She rehearsed interviews. She controlled the narrative before anyone even knew what it was. The emotional beats hit immediately. Samantha described moments of personal betrayal, instances where private family frustrations or fears were carefully reframed as public drama, moments where siblings were unwittingly cast as antagonists to amplify her story. She recounted a family dinner where a minor disagreement, meant to remain private, was later mirrored in headlines with subtle exaggeration, creating the perfect storm of sympathy for Meghan while casting doubt on her family. The irony, Samantha noted, was staggering. We were living it. The world was watching it, and believing her version instead of reality. Audience engagement deepened as Samantha leaned into her storytelling. Have you ever felt completely blindsided by someone you trusted? Imagine that multiplied millions of times, broadcast globally, and polished to perfection by media you thought you could rely on. That's what it was like. She paused, letting the weight of the statement sink in, then added with quiet intensity. And the craziest part? She never had to do it alone. Her team was trained, briefed, and coordinated to make it all seamless. Samantha then began to detail the mechanics behind the scenes. Interviews that appeared spontaneous were anything but. Key phrases, emotional cues, and carefully framed grievances were highlighted in advance. Social media narratives were guided, with public statements echoing private talking points. Every detail was scrutinized and refined to maximize emotional impact while minimizing scrutiny. She knew the world would eat it up, Samantha said. Every tear, every vulnerable moment, it was all performance. Pain was the tool, narrative was the weapon, and we were collateral. The contradictions were staggering. The public saw a woman besieged, isolated, fighting for justice. Samantha painted a different picture, a woman who anticipated the reactions of family, media, and palace alike. She described moments when Meghan would smile privately after a public revelation, an almost imperceptible satisfaction that spoke volumes. It was like watching a chess player celebrate a checkmate while everyone else was still figuring out the rules, Samantha explained. Palace alike. She described moments when Meghan would smile privately after a public revelation, an almost imperceptible satisfaction that spoke volumes. It was like watching a chess player celebrate a checkmate while everyone else was still figuring out the rules, Samantha explained. Samantha's account didn't just challenge public perception, it added layers of complexity and surprise. She revealed that even small gestures, like charitable appearances or media interviews, were strategically timed to counteract criticism or shift attention away from controversies. Every public-facing action had a dual purpose: to enhance her image while controlling the narrative around her. You might think that's smart, Samantha said, but it's manipulative. It's intentional. And it's heartbreaking when you realize you were just another piece in the game. The emotional spikes continued as Samantha delved into personal family conflicts. She described moments of anger, confusion, and sadness, highlighting the ways Meghan leveraged familial relationships for narrative gain. The siblings' disagreements, once private, became public fodder, carefully reframed as drama meant to evoke empathy from millions. Samantha's frustration was evident. Do you know what it feels like to be used as a character in your own sister's story? To have the world cheer for her while questioning your own reality. Humor and irony punctuated the narrative, making the emotional beats even more striking. Samantha recounted an incident where a minor argument was spun into a headline implying deep familial estrangement, complete with misquoted statements. "We laughed at the absurdity of it then," she said, "but inside, it was terrifying. We were losing control of our own lives." The contrast between the absurdity of the media portrayal and the gravity of private experience created tension, keeping the audience on edge. The chapter deepened when Samantha discussed the role of media allies. According to her, journalists, photographers, and even PR professionals became unwitting instruments in a premeditated strategy. They thought they were reporting the truth, she said, but the truth had already been edited before it reached them. She described examples where leaks, tips, and subtle cues directed coverage, steering stories toward the desired narrative while keeping inconvenient truths hidden. It was a machine, perfectly oiled, and we were trapped inside it. Audience questions were embedded to heighten engagement. How would you react if someone you trusted turned private pain into public performance? Samantha asked. If every story, every grievance, every personal detail was being used against you for someone else's gain, would you recognize it in time? These questions, layered amidst storytelling, forced viewers to confront their own assumptions, creating a direct connection between the family's experience and the audience's understanding of manipulation, trust, and media influence. Samantha's storytelling climaxed with revelations that directly contradicted the sympathetic image the public had embraced. She spoke of moments when Meghan allegedly misrepresented emotional distress, exaggerating or even fabricating experiences to elicit empathy and control media coverage. Every carefully orchestrated appearance, she claimed, was part of a broader plan to establish herself as the solitary royal victim, the one wronged by family and institution alike. It was genius, Samantha admitted, but also devastating to witness. She controlled perception so perfectly, it felt untouchable. The emotional and dramatic tension reached new heights as Samantha recounted private family conversations that were later mirrored in public statements, moments where the world's perception was in perfect alignment with her planned narrative. The contradictions between private truth and public story were stark, exposing the carefully calculated mechanics behind seemingly spontaneous revelations. Every personal anecdote she shared was a thread unraveling the tapestry of a persona the public had accepted unquestioningly. Then came the cliffhanger moment, the revelation that would set the stage for Doria Ragland's contribution. Samantha leaned back, her expression solemn but fierce. And just when you think you've understood the strategy, you realize there's another layer. My mother, Doria, has been watching all along. And what she knows, the things she's seen quietly, changes the entire picture. She doesn't just observe. She understands. And when she speaks, the truth becomes undeniable. The tension left in the room was almost palpable. Samantha had dismantled the public perception of Meghan's innocence, laid bare her calculated manipulation, and revealed the emotional cost borne by family members. And yet, the story was not complete. A final perspective remained, a voice that had been calm, measured, and observant, Doria Ragland's, the mother whose insights promised to connect the emotional, strategic, and psychological dots in a way no one else could. Just as Samantha's words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, the room fell into a different kind of silence. Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother, had remained quiet up to this point, her presence measured, her demeanor calm. But now, when she spoke, it was with the weight of observation, experience, and insight that no one could ignore. "I've watched this unfold for years," she began, her voice soft but unwavering. "And what you're about to understand is not anger or bitterness, it's clarity. The story people believe, it's not the whole story." Her opening lines acted like a slow, steady hand drawing back the curtain. While Thomas had focused on strategy and Samantha on motive, Doria's perspective was analytical, almost surgical, but emotionally potent. She described Meghan as a woman of incredible intelligence, someone who understood the mechanisms of influence, perception, and control in ways that most people, even family members, failed to grasp. "She's smart," Doria said, "too smart for most of us to realize at first. And what we didn't see, what I had to watch unfold quietly, is that intelligence can be used in ways that hurt the people closest to you." The first revelation Doria shared was both subtle and devastating. She spoke of the private coaching, the meticulous planning, the rehearsal of emotional responses, and the alignment of statements that, to the public, appeared spontaneous. It wasn't happenstance, she explained. She understood how to evoke empathy. She understood how to craft a story the world would consume, praise, and believe. And she used it. Imagine, for a moment, the tension that must have lived in the family household. A mother observing her daughter's genius for influence, the subtle orchestration of media appearances, the calculated emotional disclosures. Doria described moments that were almost cinematic, private conversations becoming headlines, family disputes reimagined for public sympathy, and the careful timing of statements designed to reinforce a specific narrative. "You think you know your child," she said, "until you realize every public move was part of a private plan you were only just beginning to understand." Her calm delivery heightened the impact. Unlike Samantha's fiery critique or Thomas's emotional recounting, Doria's tone was measured, almost meditative. But that calmness only amplified the gravity of her observations. She painted a picture of an individual who had mastered the art of persuasion, the careful curation of image, and the subtle guidance of perception. To the outside world, Meghan appeared authentic, vulnerable, and sincere. But Doria revealed that what viewers consumed was only a fraction of the truth, selected and framed with near-perfect precision. The contradictions were glaring. How could someone be so publicly vulnerable, so universally sympathetic, and yet so strategically in control? Doria addressed this directly, revealing the emotional intelligence behind every calculated move. It wasn't simply about public perception, she said. It was about controlling every narrative, anticipating reactions, and shaping events to maintain a consistent image. She described subtle cues, moments of emotional calibration, and careful alignment with media outlets that ensured the story unfolded exactly as intended. One anecdote in particular illustrated her point vividly. Doria recounted a family gathering that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. A dinner, laughter, casual conversation. But in reality, it was part of a rehearsal for media engagement. Meghan had been practicing phrasing, testing emotional responses, and observing the way different personalities reacted to her words. Even in private, Doria said, she was thinking about the public. Every smile, every pause, every gesture. It was a lesson, a rehearsal, a setup. Audience engagement deepened as Doria posed questions that invited reflection. How would you react if the person you loved most in the world was constantly analyzing, guiding, and directing your emotions to serve a larger narrative? How do you reconcile love with manipulation? Her rhetorical questions forced viewers to sit with the uncomfortable tension between familial affection and strategic calculation, heightening curiosity and empathy. The storytelling reached a dramatic spike when Doria revealed the psychological precision behind Meghan's public persona. She described how Meghan had cultivated a dual image, one of vulnerability and struggle, another of intelligence and foresight. The public consumed only the vulnerability, leaving the foresight hidden in the shadows. Doria's observations suggested that this duality was intentional, designed to generate sympathy while shielding ambition from scrutiny. It was a performance, Doria said, not just for the media, but for everyone around her. And it worked brilliantly. Then came the shocking twist. Doria explained that Meghan had even guided responses from family members, anticipating how they would react and subtly shaping interactions to reinforce her narrative. She coached without ever seeming to coach, Doria said. She influenced without anyone realizing they were influenced. And by the time the world saw the story, it was exactly what she wanted them to see. The revelation was jarring. Family members themselves had become instruments in a strategy they had barely noticed unfolding. Emotional tension escalated as Doria described the toll this had taken on the family. Watching from the sidelines, she had seen Thomas and Samantha struggle with feelings of confusion, betrayal, and helplessness. "You feel powerless," she explained, "because the story that is told to the world contradicts the reality you live. You are trapped between love, loyalty, and the recognition that someone you care about is using every tool at their disposal to control perception." Audience questions were interwoven seamlessly. Have you ever felt your trust used as a lever? Have you ever wondered if someone close to you was manipulating reality? That's the space we lived in. Every moment, every conversation, every interview was a test of perception, and we were not always aware we were being tested. The emotional resonance was heightened by Doria's calm, almost understated delivery, an emotional spike delivered through observation rather than fury. The chapter built to a crescendo as Doria explained the culmination of Meghan's strategy, the establishment of herself as the singular royal victim. Every conflict, every perceived slight, every media story, all pointed to one goal, she said: to position herself as the one wronged, the one misunderstood, the one deserving of the world's sympathy. And she achieved it with precision. The audience is forced to reconcile the idea of empathy with the reality of orchestration, a tension that maintains engagement and curiosity. Doria also addressed contradictions directly, highlighting moments when public displays of emotion clashed with private strategy. She recounted interviews that seemed spontaneous but were guided behind the scenes, public appearances that coincided with media leaks, and statements that amplified selective grievances while minimizing inconvenient truths. It wasn't coincidence, she said. It was design, an understanding that is painful. The storytelling climaxed with the implication that this orchestration extended beyond personal gain. It influenced media, public perception, and the royal family itself. Every move, every tear, every carefully timed revelation was part of a broader strategy to control narrative, command attention, and solidify a role as the ultimate royal victim. "We were witnesses," Doria said softly, "and sometimes participants, in a story that wasn't fully ours." Finally, the chapter closed with a cliffhanger that set the stage for the next segment. "And while Thomas and Samantha have shown you pieces of the puzzle," Doria said, voice low but intense, "what you're about to see next reveals the full extent of the plan, the moments you never noticed, the cues you never questioned, and the strategy that changed everything. But what comes next will shock even the most loyal fans." The room fell silent again, heavy with anticipation. Doria's words had reframed the narrative, connecting strategy, motive, and emotional manipulation in a way that left no room for doubt. And as the audience sat on the edge of revelation, they were left with one burning question: what had been orchestrated next, and how far had this strategy truly reached? And just like that, the silence gave way to a revelation that demanded attention. The victim narrative, so long assumed to be genuine, so widely embraced, and so carefully propagated, was not what it seemed. Thomas, Samantha, and Doria had hinted at strategy and manipulation, but now the mechanics behind Meghan's carefully curated persona were about to be exposed. The question everyone needed to confront was simple but chilling. Was the Meghan Markle the world had sympathized with a true victim, or a meticulously constructed figure designed to command empathy, control perception, and shape every conversation around her? The chapter opened with a story that seemed almost too precise to be true. Thomas described a moment when Meghan's public complaint about the pressures of royal life coincided perfectly with the release of a media article portraying her as beleaguered and unsupported. It wasn't a coincidence, he said. She knew exactly how to align the timeline. Every complaint, every tear, every word. It was designed to hit the media at the right moment, to generate the exact response she wanted. The room was quiet. Every listener could feel the gravity. The image of a vulnerable, suffering princess had been orchestrated. Samantha jumped in, emphasizing the personal impact of these manipulations. We were left to pick up the pieces, she said. Every family conversation we had could later become a headline or a quote. Every disagreement was an opportunity for her narrative to grow. She didn't just live the story, she curated it. Her voice rose slightly, charged with frustration and disbelief. The public thinks they're witnessing authenticity. They aren't. They're watching performance art, emotional precision, carefully scripted, perfectly timed. Doria added a mother's perspective, calm but devastating. She explained that Meghan's strategy had roots in subtle psychological cues and preparation. From body language to vocal inflection, every appearance was analyzed and optimized for maximum effect. She understood human empathy better than anyone I've ever seen, Doria said. And she used it. She guided the media, influenced our family, and controlled public perception in ways that left all of us stunned, even when we suspected something was off. The chapter wove together multiple strands: public performance, media manipulation, and family influence. Thomas provided concrete examples of rehearsed spontaneity, interviews where responses seemed off the cuff but had been practiced with her team. Samantha highlighted instances of selective disclosure, moments when personal stories were amplified to make her appear sympathetic, while inconvenient truths were minimized or omitted. Doria explained the subtle orchestration of timing: when to appear distressed, when to appear confident, when to release information to the press. The synergy of all three perspectives painted a chilling, cohesive picture of a masterful narrative architect at work. Audience engagement spiked when the narrative shifted to contrast perception and reality. Think about the moments you cheered for her, Samantha asked. The interviews where she seemed honest, the social media posts where she appeared vulnerable. What if all of that was planned? How would you feel if the person you admired had been manipulating not only your perception, but the very reality around them? The question lingered, uncomfortably close to home. It demanded introspection and kept the audience hooked, desperate to understand the mechanics behind the facade. Then came the shocking twist. The coordination extended beyond media and family. It infiltrated institutional response. Doria revealed that Meghan's careful framing had influenced palace communications, dictating not just public narratives, but the tone and timing of royal responses. It wasn't just interviews or Instagram posts, she explained. It was letters, press statements, and public appearances. Every move seemed spontaneous, but behind it was calculation, strategy that positioned her as the wrong party in every scenario. Thomas added emotional weight, recounting a particularly telling incident. A private conversation with him was leaked, exaggerated, and framed in a media report to support Meghan's public grievances. I didn't know until I saw it, he said, shaking his head. It was edited, selective, and strategically leaked. The story they built around it painted me as unsympathetic and her as the victim. That's the level of orchestration we're talking about. Audience curiosity spiked further as Samantha discussed the role of her team. She described a small, coordinated group of advisors, publicists, and allies who helped craft Meghan's appearances, interviews, and social media presence. It wasn't ad hoc, Samantha said. It was a system, precision engineering for narrative control. Every public interaction was vetted, every word calculated. And it worked. Doria then elevated the emotional stakes, highlighting the personal toll. We, her family, became props in a story we didn't fully understand. Our words, our gestures, even our silence, were interpreted and used to reinforce a story we weren't invited to shape. The emotional strain of living in a curated narrative is profound. Her calm voice made the revelation all the more piercing. The strategy was not just public, it was deeply invasive, affecting the very fabric of familial trust and communication. The storytelling was punctuated with sharp contrasts: public perception versus private reality, tears versus calculation, sympathy versus manipulation. These juxtapositions created tension, keeping viewers engaged while simultaneously revealing the depth of strategic planning. Samantha emphasized the most shocking aspect. The victim narrative had been positioned to be untouchable, a story so compelling that few dared question it publicly. It was protected, she said. Criticism was framed as cruelty. Dissent, even from family, was spun as attack. The narrative shield was impenetrable. Audience questions reinforced engagement. If someone can manipulate perception so completely, how do you know what to believe? If the victim you see is engineered, what does that say about the stories you consume? Could you recognize manipulation if it was happening around you? These questions forced the audience to wrestle with their assumptions, building suspense for the next reveal. Then came the narrative crescendo, specific examples of how the strategy was executed. Samantha recounted a media cycle where Meghan's statements, palace communications, and social media posts all aligned perfectly, creating the illusion of ongoing persecution. Doria highlighted subtle body language cues that were rehearsed, conveying distress or innocence on command. Thomas emphasized timing, how statements were released to coincide with public events or potential distractions, ensuring maximum exposure and sympathetic coverage. Together, their accounts created a portrait of a narrative machine operating with precision and purpose. And just when you thought you had seen the full picture, the narrative shifts, and this time, it enters the hallowed, tightly guarded halls of Buckingham Palace. The palace is a world of its own. Centuries-old traditions, strict protocols, and unspoken rules that dictate behavior, appearances, and even emotions. For Meghan Markle, according to Thomas, Samantha, and Doria, this world was not a place of constraint. It was a stage, an arena in which her strategy unfolded with meticulous precision. The question that immediately arises is stark. How could one person manipulate not just public perception, but the very responses of a centuries-old institution? Thomas began with a chilling observation. The palace isn't an easy place to influence, he said, voice heavy with gravity. It's structured, hierarchical, and guarded. But she managed to bend it subtly, to make her story resonate in ways that benefited her narrative. He described moments when private complaints, conveyed discreetly, were amplified in ways that seemed almost orchestrated. Meetings with senior staff, off-the-record conversations with aides, and carefully timed letters all became tools in a broader strategy. The palace, normally impenetrable, was responding, sometimes unconsciously, to her carefully guided cues. Samantha leaned in, her tone more urgent, highlighting the tension and contradictions. People think the royals are detached, cold, and distant, she said. But even within those walls, her influence was felt. Decisions that seemed routine were subtly affected. Reactions were guided by the story she wanted the world to hear. And the more the palace reacted, the stronger her narrative became. She painted an image of a web, where every interaction, no matter how private, fed into the larger story of victimhood, positioning Meghan as the misunderstood outsider who needed protection, sympathy, and public validation. Doria's contribution added layers of emotional complexity. She described observing the strain this strategy placed not only on the palace staff, but on family members within those walls. Imagine a home where everyone knows protocol, tradition, and expectation, she explained. Now imagine someone introducing a narrative that subtly reshapes those expectations, guiding responses, eliciting sympathy, and controlling perception. It's both clever and emotionally taxing. Her calm tone only amplified the tension. The audience could feel the enormity of the stakes. The palace, according to their accounts, became an unintended collaborator. Reactions from senior royals, aides, and staff were often in line with the narrative Meghan projected: protective, sympathetic, and occasionally conflicted. She was, in essence, directing a centuries-old institution without it realizing the extent of her influence. Thomas described one specific incident. A seemingly minor disagreement escalated internally, not because of the issue itself, but because her framing of events had influenced who saw the problem and how it was interpreted. The narrative, once again, shaped reality. Audience engagement spiked as Samantha detailed the emotional fallout. Staff and royals were caught in a difficult position. They wanted to respond appropriately, maintain decorum, and protect the institution's image. Yet, according to her, the guidance they were unknowingly receiving amplified Meghan's personal narrative, reinforcing the perception of victimhood. It was a delicate dance, Samantha said. One misstep, and the story could unravel, or so she made everyone believe. And because she had trained her audience, family, staff, and the public alike, the reactions consistently fed her desired outcome. Doria elaborated on the subtle psychological strategies at play. Meghan, she explained, was acutely aware of how hierarchy, protocol, and expectation influenced behavior. By presenting herself in a particular emotional state, emphasizing perceived slights, and coordinating timing with media narratives, she could manipulate both the perception of individuals and the responses of entire departments. It wasn't just performance for cameras, Doria said. It was performance for influence, inside and outside the palace. The chapter deepened as Thomas discussed the ripple effects. Senior aides, normally neutral or procedural, began responding in ways that reinforced her story. Public appearances were coordinated to suggest isolation or distress. Internal communications reflected concern, protection, and empathy, aligning seamlessly with the image the world was already consuming. The palace had, unintentionally, become an accomplice in the narrative, validating the persona carefully cultivated by Meghan. Samantha highlighted the contradictions and irony. The institution renowned for discipline and tradition was being subtly manipulated by someone perceived as an outsider. Staff members, loyal to the monarchy, unknowingly reinforced the story, while family members wrestled with the tension between public perception and private reality. It's almost poetic, Samantha said, her voice tinged with frustration. The system she wanted to challenge ended up validating her narrative, and everyone, royals, staff, and the public, played a role. Audience questions intensified the engagement. Have you ever seen someone so persuasive that even institutions bend without realizing it? What happens when strategy infiltrates loyalty, tradition, and trust? Can anyone really resist someone who knows exactly how to guide perception? These questions kept the viewer hooked, building anticipation for the next revelation. The drama escalated when Doria described the personal toll on those within the palace. Family members were caught between duty and the carefully crafted narrative they could not ignore. Staff faced conflicting responsibilities, maintaining protocol while responding to perceived emotional distress. Every interaction became a potential trigger, every word a tool in a story they were unknowingly helping to write. Imagine walking through a house where every glance, every nod, every comment is being calculated and redirected, Doria said. That's what it was like. Emotionally, mentally, it's exhausting. Thomas added a particularly sharp twist. He described a situation where a seemingly routine media report about palace dissatisfaction or internal conflict actually played into Meghan's narrative. It wasn't manipulation of news alone, he explained. It was the palace responding to the story as if it were true, even when the facts didn't align. Every move she made was calculated to evoke reaction. She understood influence on a systemic level. The storytelling crescendoed as Samantha linked this strategy back to public perception. The audience had witnessed the palace angle, the influence, the subtle guidance, the emotional manipulations that played out behind closed doors. This added a new dimension. The narrative was no longer about private family disagreements or media manipulation alone. It had infiltrated one of the most rigid and scrutinized institutions in the world. Meghan's narrative, they revealed, was both a personal and institutional phenomenon. And just when the palace drama seemed like the pinnacle of tension, the story pivots back home, into the hearts and minds of those who lived with the ripple effects every single day. The Markle family, as Thomas and Samantha repeatedly emphasized, was not merely a bystander to Meghan's public life. It had been caught in the crossfire of a narrative carefully crafted to manipulate perception and emotion. The question, now, becomes intensely personal. What happens when a family becomes collateral in a story engineered for global consumption? Thomas opened with an emotional account of the initial shock. "You think you know your child," he said quietly, almost to himself. until you see how the world reacts to her version of events. And then you realize she's left you out of the story entirely. Or worse, cast you as the villain. The pain in his voice was palpable. He described reading headlines that misrepresented private conversations, watching family grievances exaggerated or reframed, and witnessing personal history rewritten for media approval. Every misalignment between reality and perception was a dagger, twisting in the hearts of those closest to her. Samantha's perspective was sharper, more visceral. She recalled moments when she tried to confront Meghan, attempting to bridge the gap between private family truths and public narrative. Every attempt, she explained, was deflected or reframed, subtly reinforcing the story Meghan wanted the world to see. "We were silenced," Samantha said. "Not with words, not with threats, but with control of the story. Every time we spoke, she had already moved the narrative 2 steps ahead." The emotional stakes were high, leaving the audience reeling with the tension between familial loyalty and manipulation. Doria's contribution added depth and calm insight. She explained how observing these dynamics affected family cohesion, emotional stability, and trust. "You start questioning your own memory," she said. "You start wondering if the version of events you witnessed was somehow inaccurate because the story that others are seeing is so compelling, so polished. And it's exhausting. You love your child, you want to protect them, but you also have to protect yourself and your reality." The audience could feel the weight. Emotional exhaustion compounded by betrayal, the intimate pain of realizing you were maneuvered without consent. The chapter wove storytelling with illustrative anecdotes to maintain engagement. Thomas described a family holiday, the kind of gathering meant for laughter and connection, which became a minefield for public exploitation. Every conversation could become a quote. Every disagreement could be reframed as conflict, he explained. "We had to navigate normal life while knowing that what happened in our home could be twisted for media consumption the next day." The tension was immediate, relatable, and emotionally gripping for viewers who have experienced personal betrayals or manipulation, albeit on a different scale. Samantha detailed further consequences, showing how personal grievances were amplified through media channels. "It's one thing to be manipulated," she said, "but it's another to watch your family members' emotions turned into content for the world to judge." She gave examples of interviews where subtle family tensions, misunderstood jokes, mild disagreements, were extracted, highlighted, and made to appear as dramatic fractures in familial bonds. The audience began to see the scale. It was not just one person's narrative. It was a system of amplification, carefully curated to maintain sympathy and control. The irony was biting. The Markle family, deeply invested in authenticity, was rendered powerless by a combination of strategic calculation, media complicity, and public fascination. Doria pointed out a particularly disturbing contradiction. The world applauded Meghan's supposed courage while criticizing or dismissing the voices of her own family. "We weren't the villains," Doria said softly. "We were simply not part of the performance." And in a way, that silence made us appear guilty by omission. Thomas described moments of frustration and heartbreak. Family members were caught between confronting the narrative and protecting relationships, unsure if speaking out would worsen public perception or familial estrangement. The emotional toll was immense. You want to speak the truth, but every word you say can be weaponized. You want to protect your child, but every effort to do so seems to push them further into the narrative they've built. The audience could feel the tension build. One wrong move, and the fallout could be catastrophic. Samantha emphasized the psychological burden. She described the uncertainty and fear, the constant awareness that private words, private actions, and private mistakes could be magnified and reframed. Every interaction became layered with suspicion, every attempt at communication fraught with risk. "It's like walking a tightrope over a pit filled with cameras," she said. "And the rope is moving beneath your feet, and you don't know if you'll fall or if you'll be blamed for the fall." Doria introduced a critical layer of reflection, the long-term implications on family dynamics. The manipulation, she explained, had lasting consequences on trust, bonding, and emotional intimacy. "Relationships are fragile," she said, "and when one member manipulates narrative to this degree, it changes how everyone communicates, behaves, and perceives each other." It's not just about headlines. It's about the erosion of closeness, the subtle reshaping of family identity. Her calm delivery allowed the audience to process the full weight of this insight, emphasizing that the fallout extended far beyond public perception. The chapter also included audience-directed engagement. Have you ever felt powerless while watching someone you love control a story? How do you protect your truth when the world is consuming another version? Imagine the frustration, the heartbreak, and the isolation. These rhetorical questions forced viewers to reflect personally, keeping them emotionally tethered to the narrative while anticipating further revelations. The tension intensified when Samantha revealed the pivotal moment that crystallized the family's realization. A public statement or interview by Meghan that aligned perfectly with media coverage, confirming suspicions that her victimhood had been choreographed. It was then we knew, Samantha said, that this was no longer about misunderstanding or perception. It was about deliberate control. Thomas echoed this, adding that the alignment of private actions with public messaging demonstrated an almost surgical precision. Doria, meanwhile, highlighted the broader emotional consequences for herself and other family members. Watching the story unfold, knowing we had been part of it without realizing, it's like living in a world where reality is constantly rewritten, she said. Every day, every event, every reaction has a second, invisible layer, and you're caught in between the two. That tension never leaves you. The storytelling crescendo came as the three voices converged, each reinforcing the central point. The narrative Meghan cultivated created real, tangible damage to those closest to her. Families were estranged, trust was eroded, and emotions were manipulated for the benefit of perception rather than truth. The audience, caught in the interplay of strategy, motive, and consequence, could feel both the scale of the manipulation and the intimate personal cost. And just when you thought the story couldn't get more intricate, the lens widens to a world most people only glimpse from a distance. The media, headlines, interviews, social media posts, all of it carefully choreographed, guided, and, according to Thomas, Samantha, and Doria, subtly controlled. The question is immediate and jarring. How far can one person shape the narrative of an entire press machine, bending stories, framing perceptions, and commanding public sympathy with surgical precision? Thomas opened with a statement that set the tone for the chapter. The media isn't independent. Not in this case. Every article, every interview, every leak, they were all influenced, some knowingly, some unknowingly. And we were trapped inside it, helpless to stop it. The image that emerges is chilling. A media landscape operating not just on curiosity or newsworthiness, but as instruments in a premeditated narrative. Every headline, every sympathetic article, was an echo of an orchestration that few outside the inner circle realized existed. Samantha expanded on the mechanics, highlighting the subtle but consistent patterns of media influence. She described phone calls with journalists that seemed casual, interviews that appeared spontaneous, and articles that coincided almost perfectly with private family events. It wasn't luck, she said. It was deliberate. Timing, phrasing, imagery, everything was calculated to maximize empathy, control perception, and minimize scrutiny. The irony was sharp. The very outlets known for scrutiny and investigative rigor were unwitting participants in the narrative, reinforcing a persona carefully curated for public consumption. Doria offered a calm, almost analytical perspective. She understood the psychology of media, she said. She knew how journalists think, how audiences react, and how to frame stories so that the narrative she wanted would dominate, while dissenting voices were muted or ignored. Her observations painted a picture of strategic genius, one that blended emotional intelligence with tactical acumen. This was not haphazard influence. It was meticulous, studied, and consistently applied. The chapter deepened as Thomas recounted specific examples. He described interviews where seemingly offhand comments were highlighted and repeated in headlines, reinforcing a story of victimhood. Small, private disputes were leaked selectively, magnified by journalists, and presented as evidence of hardship. You begin to notice patterns, Thomas explained. The repetition, the framing, the selective amplification, it's a system. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The tension for the audience grew because the implication was clear. The media, often revered as a source of truth, had been subtly guided, sometimes unknowingly, into reinforcing a narrative designed for control. Samantha added personal insight into the coaching. She described meetings with Meghan's advisors, moments where phrasing for interviews was tested and responses rehearsed. Every answer was vetted. Every story angle was considered. And every emotional cue was optimized, she said. The emotional spike was immediate. The audience is forced to reconcile the image of authenticity with the reality of premeditation. Public vulnerability, it seems, had been engineered. Doria elaborated on the psychological dimension, emphasizing how media manipulation intersected with human empathy. Meghan had mastered the art of signaling emotional distress while maintaining a controlled narrative, guiding journalists to react with sympathy. This created a feedback loop. Sympathetic reporting reinforced public perception, which in turn validated the narrative she had crafted. "It's brilliant," Doria said quietly, "but it's also heartbreaking when you see how carefully everything is orchestrated." The contradictions were sharp. Public perception painted Meghan as spontaneous, genuine, and vulnerable. The behind-the-scenes reality, however, revealed meticulous orchestration, emotional calibration, and strategic release of information. Samantha highlighted the cognitive dissonance this creates for audiences. "People want to believe in authenticity," she said. "But the truth is often hidden behind performance. And the more people empathize, the stronger the illusion becomes." Audience engagement intensified with rhetorical questions. Have you ever wondered why certain stories dominate coverage while others are quietly buried? How much of what you see is reality, and how much is shaped to elicit a specific reaction? If you were in her position, could you have done the same? These questions invited reflection, compelling viewers to analyze media consumption habits and consider the mechanics of narrative control. Thomas then provided a particularly striking example of media timing. He described how social media posts, interviews, and news stories were coordinated with private family events and palace occurrences. The effect was seamless. Events that could have appeared mundane were reframed to support her ongoing story of persecution and resilience. "It's like watching a conductor orchestrate an entire symphony," Thomas said, "and everyone else is playing along without realizing the score exists." Doria followed with the psychological implications for those inside the family. The constant alignment of media coverage with private life created stress, doubt, and tension. "You begin to question reality," she explained. "If everything you say, everything you do, can be reframed for the public, how do you know what is true? And how do you protect yourself when even the media, which should be independent, becomes a participant in the narrative?" Her calm delivery heightened the impact, illustrating the subtle yet profound psychological effects of living under such manipulation. The chapter built toward a climax as Samantha described the emotional toll. Family members felt trapped, their voices muted, their perspectives dismissed. Private disagreements became public spectacles. Personal emotions were twisted into media content. And the more the media amplified Meghan's narrative, the more entrenched the perception became. "It's a machine," Samantha said. "A machine that turns family, emotion, and truth into fuel for a story that benefits only one person." And just when you think the story has revealed all its layers, a new dimension emerges. One that goes beyond family, beyond media, and beyond the palace walls. This is where ambition, influence, and the quest for control come to the forefront. Thomas, Samantha, and Doria painted a chilling portrait of Meghan Markle not just as a master of narrative, but as a strategist wielding power with precision, fully aware of how fame could be leveraged to her advantage. The question now becomes, how far would someone go to control both perception and reality, to secure influence and protect their image at every turn? Thomas began with a statement that immediately reframed the narrative. "It wasn't just about being seen as a victim," he said, voice low and intense. "It was about controlling the conversation, the perception, and ultimately, the outcomes that would affect her personally and professionally." Every move had a purpose. Every tear, every complaint. It was a calculated step in a larger strategy. His words sent a ripple through the audience's understanding. This was no longer just a story about media manipulation or family drama. This was a story about power, the the subtle, psychological, and tactical exertion of influence to achieve objectives that few could fully recognize. Samantha jumped in, emphasizing the scope of the strategy. We, as family, were caught in her orbit, she explained, her tone sharp with frustration. Not only were we being misrepresented, but we were also being used to further her positioning. The world sees one narrative, but behind the scenes, every interaction, every event, every photo opportunity was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. She recounted instances where private family disagreements were strategically leaked to media outlets to generate headlines, subtly reinforcing her image as the wronged outsider while shaping the public discourse. Doria added a measured, analytical perspective. This was about influence on multiple levels, she said calmly. It wasn't merely about sympathy or attention. It was about positioning herself at the intersection of media, fame, and the royal institution. She understood that controlling the narrative wasn't just about perception. It was about creating leverage, power, and control. Her insight illuminated a deeper layer of strategy, highlighting the calculated way in which fame could be weaponized to influence outcomes far beyond immediate visibility. The emotional intensity of the chapter deepened when Thomas recounted the psychological impact on family members. Being caught in the crossfire of a highly controlled narrative generated feelings of frustration, helplessness, and betrayal. You start questioning reality, he explained. You're constantly trying to reconcile what you know to be true with the story everyone else believes. And it's exhausting. Emotionally, mentally, and relationally. The audience felt the tension, drawn into the intimate perspective of a family navigating an unseen but powerful force shaping their lives. Samantha elaborated, revealing the intersection of strategy and ambition. Power doesn't just manifest in wealth or status, she said. It manifests in control, control of narrative, control of perception, control of influence. And that's exactly what she sought. Every public appearance, every interview, every media engagement was a step toward consolidating her position, both inside the palace and in the public consciousness. The clarity of her explanation painted Meghan as not merely reactive, but proactive, orchestrating outcomes that served long-term goals. Doria then introduced the concept of narrative as leverage. By positioning herself as the singular royal victim, Meghan could command attention, sympathy, and, ultimately, influence decisions within her personal and professional spheres. When you control the story, Doria explained, you control the reaction. You guide perception, anticipate pushback, and create the conditions you want, all without appearing aggressive or manipulative. It's subtle, but it's powerful. The audience was left to grasp the scale of influence being described, the chilling sophistication of the strategy, and the emotional implications for those caught in its wake. The chapter continued with specific examples that illustrated hidden agendas. Thomas recounted situations where public narratives coincided with personal goals, subtly steering attention and shaping outcomes. Samantha highlighted the manipulation of social media engagement, timing posts, and crafting public appearances to maintain narrative dominance. Doria detailed the psychological preparation behind these moves, from carefully phrased statements to the orchestration of emotional cues in interviews. Every layer reinforced the notion that the strategy extended beyond perception, influencing reality itself. Audience engagement heightened as rhetorical questions were posed. If someone you love can manipulate events, perception, and narrative to this extent, how do you respond? How do you maintain your own reality when every action, every statement, every word is already calculated and potentially used against you? Could you recognize it while it's happening? These questions created a tension that drew viewers deeper into the narrative, compelling them to reflect on both the familial and broader social dimensions of influence. Samantha described the long-term consequences of this orchestration. Relationships within the family became strained, trust eroded, and even seemingly minor disagreements were scrutinized for their potential public impact. It's exhausting, she said. Every interaction felt like a chess piece being moved without our consent. And the more we realized, the more we understood how intentional it all was. The emotional resonance underscored the personal stakes, amplifying the dramatic tension. Doria brought the narrative full circle by connecting hidden agendas to broader outcomes. By controlling perception, Meghan had positioned herself to navigate challenges with maximum advantage. It wasn't random, she emphasized. It was deliberate, strategic, and sustained over time.